What's up? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Holly and this is my booktube channel. I talk about books and reading, and I'm usually drinking some kind of coffee, but today I'm actually just drinking some Earl Grey tea. I don't really know why. I guess based on the books we're going to be talking about today, it's making me think of law and therefore law school. And one of my best friends from law school and I, every time we would study, we drank Earl Grey tea for some reason. Either that or caramel macchiatos, back when I was really into those. But Earl Grey tea always shoots me right back to law school memories, and I thought it was appropriate for this video. As you may have noticed from the title of this video, we're talking true crime new releases. I love the true crime genre. It is a nonfiction genre, obviously, talking about real crimes, typically serial killers, mass murderers, really fascinating cases of criminals and the different crimes they've committed. And in honor of this subject matter, I am wearing a shirt that I got from the Spicy Dragon Company. I don't know if y'all can see it, but it says True Crime, Glass of Wine, Bed by 9. That is so telling of my personality, and I love their shop. Again, that's the Spicy Dragon Company. I'll link their shop down below so that you can go check it out. They have a ton of true crime merchandise and horror merchandise, and it's always a good idea to shop small and support small businesses, so make sure to go check them out. So today I have a list of true crime new releases that are coming out in the month of March. I actually have a few that will be coming out at the tail end of February, because when this video comes out, I think we still have a few days of February left, so you'll be able to check those out as well. And if you see me looking down in this video, it's because I have my laptop sitting in front of me. I usually make a list of the books I want to discuss and my notes and my thoughts on them so that I can more coherently deliver them to you. So if I'm looking down, that's what I'm looking at. The first book that I have for you is called Toxic Exposure: The True Story Behind the Monsanto Trials and the Search for Justice by Chad Nabhan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So Monsanto was the creator of the product Roundup. I'm pretty sure everybody's heard of Roundup. It's literally the weed killer for your yard. This was a product that the creator swore for years that it was perfectly safe and wouldn't harm you in any sort of way. Well, the author of this book is actually a medical expert and was an expert witness in these trials against the creator of Roundup. There was a study done in 2015 that found out that Roundup actually contained a toxic ingredient linked to cancer, and there was a lot of people that were coming out saying that they had developed cancer, specifically Hodgkin's lymphoma, from using Roundup. And there was this entire court case about it, and the author in this book goes into a deep dive about all the backstory and his research and how he testified as an expert witness in these cases and proved that there really was a link between Roundup and the cancer that these people had contracted. This book sounds really fascinating to me. There was a time in my life where I practiced law that was in this type of realm, kind of a tort case type of law. So I find it really interesting, and yeah, if you're interested as well, make sure to check it out. That is Toxic Exposure, coming out February 28th. We have another book coming out February 28th called Cops in the Crosshairs. This one is by Bruce Mauday. This deals with the sniper cop slayings that happened in 1972. The officers' names were William Davis and Richard Posey, and they were killed by sniper fire. These killings made national news back in 1972, but this is actually the first book that ever covers them or goes into them in any sort of detail. There was a man named Ansel Hamm, which was a member of the Johnston gang back then, and he was the one responsible for committing these murders. And while the book goes into the entire investigation and the trial, what I find really interesting about this one is that it contains actual word-for-word interviews with the killer, which just sounds fascinating. I love anything where you get an insight into the criminal's mind and their thoughts and motivations and why they would do such a horrific crime. So I'm really anxious to see this one come out. Again, that is Small Town Cops in the Crosshairs, coming out February 28th. The next book that I have for you comes out March 7th, and it is called Unexpected: The Backstory of Finding Elizabeth Smart and Growing Up in the Culture of American Religion by Chris Thomas. Do y'all remember Elizabeth Smart? Do you remember her abduction and the heavy news coverage at the time? If you're kind of a 90s kid, you may sort of remember it growing up. Your parents probably used it to threaten you about why you shouldn't walk away from them in the grocery store, at least mine did. Kind of a interesting parenting tactic, but you might remember her story. The author is one of the nation's top crisis communicators, and he was on the Elizabeth Smart case at the time. He basically managed a lot of what was going on, and he was kind of the publicist for Elizabeth Smart's family during the 10-month period that she had been abducted. Interestingly, the author himself grew up in the Mormon religion and culture, and since that was such an integral part of Elizabeth Smart's case and why she was abducted, his perspective into the matter was really critical. He goes into how his experiences in the Mormon religion and culture helped him on this case and how it helped him do his job, and I find that perspective really fascinating. So this one looks really good. If you're interested, make sure to pick up Unexpected, coming out March 7th. This next one sounds really interesting. This is a story I've never heard before, and a little caveat to this one, this book actually came out last year in 2022, but it is being released in paperback for the first time March 7th of this year. So if you're like me and you like to wait for things to come out in paperback so you don't have to spend $30 on a hardback, this might be one you pick up. This one is called Hell's Half Acre: The Untold Story of the Benders, a Serial Killer Family on the American Frontier by Susan Jonasis. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is a true story that took place in 1873, right after the Civil War in, I believe, the state of Kansas. So there was like this orchard and an abandoned cabin nearby this orchard, and countless bodies were found buried under this orchard next to this abandoned cabin. The family that once lived in that cabin was the Bender family. They were the ones responsible for all of these murders and all of these bodies that were found in this orchard. However, when the bodies were discovered, the Benders were nowhere to be found. This started an epic manhunt that lasted for decades, and the book not only goes into that, but also how the culture at the time in 1873 sort of allowed these murders to take place, or maybe turned a blind eye to them. I'm not sure what they mean by that, but I do find that interesting. And also, interestingly enough, this case remains unsolved to this day. I guess the Benders have never been found, and probably won't be, because I assume they're dead. It was 1873. I would think. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to pick up the paperback copy of Hell's Half Acre on March 7th. Next up, on March 14th, we have a book called We Were Once Family by Roxana Asgharian. This is an expose type of read of the foster care system and the adoption systems that pretty much failed in this story. So this takes place in March of 2018. An SUV was found at the bottom of a cliff, and the bodies of 2 adult women and several children were found in the vehicle dead. The 2 adult women in the vehicle were Jennifer and Sarah Hart. They were a married couple from Texas. They had adopted, I think, like 6 children out of different foster homes in Texas throughout the state. The book makes mention that all of these children happen to be Black children. I don't know if that plays a role in the story. It might. It doesn't really say as far as the synopsis goes, but they did some digging and found out there was this horrible history of abuse and neglect by these 2 women against these poor children. And it kind of goes into how the foster and adoption system really failed these children in, I'm assuming, not vetting these women out properly. Apparently, the state of Texas knew very little about the women that it had allowed 6 children to be adopted to. So while that's not exactly a murder case, or maybe it is, I still don't know why the SUV was found at the bottom of the cliff. I guess you'd have to read to see. It is a really interesting true crime story that I think sounds really good. Again, that is We Were Once Family, coming out March 14th. Also on March 14th, we have Angel Makers by Patty McCracken coming out. This story is unique, and I certainly have never heard of it, but it sounds like something that was made up. This is a story about a midwife in the 1920s that had a murder ring of women helping her, and altogether I think they murdered like over 160 men. This story occurred in what is now modern-day Hungary, and the women in this murder ring were midwives, moms, daughters, farmers' wives, just regular women throughout the community. What the midwife would do was she would take fly paper, distill it, and extract the arsenic out of it, and they would use that to poison these men and kill them. At first, it seemed like the poison was only being used on abusive spouses, but then it starts to get worse. They start to use it against sickly relatives in order to inherit their land and things of that nature, so it really started to spiral out of control. Then in about 1929, an anonymous note was sent to a prosecutor, and the whole thing started unraveling. The prosecutor started investigating it and figuring it out and putting all the pieces together. The book starts with the first initial murders and goes all the way to the trial and what happened with that. So that sounds fascinating. My lawyer self thinks that it sounds so cool that it's from the perspective of this prosecutor, and I'm anxious to see how this one turns out. It's crazy that it's a true story and that this actually happened, that they got away for like 9 years with killing over 160 people. That just blows my mind. So if you're into that kind of thing, make sure you check out Angel Makers, coming out March 21st. Excuse me, March 14th. What am I saying? Next one. March 21st, we have Ghosts of the Orphanage coming out. The author's name is Christine Keneally? I'm butchering these poor people's names. This book dives into the secrets of 20th century orphanages and all of the violence and abuse and horrible things that took place there. Apparently, survivors of these orphanages had been trying to tell their stories for years, but a series of circumstances, or maybe even people, kept them and their voices from being heard. The book kind of centers on a particular orphanage called St. Joseph's. I think it was in Vermont. And while it centers on just the one orphanage, it does go into the problems with countless orphanages all across the globe and orphanages as an institution. So that sounds really interesting and maybe a little heartbreaking, but if you're interested in that story, make sure to check out Ghosts of the Orphanage, coming out March 21st. This next book is another story I've never heard of, but it comes out March 21st, and it is called Satellite Boy by Andrew Amalinks. Man, nobody's got an easy last name today, but I'm doing my best. This takes place in the early days of the Cold War, and it talks about the connection between this bank heist that happened at the time and the space race that gave rise to the modern communication age as we know it. How those two things are linked, I'm not really sure, but apparently the bank heist all happened because of this criminal mastermind named George LeMay, and he was able to get away with this heist and hide out in Florida for a really long time. And I think he was hiding out on like his yacht, so definitely living the high life off of his spoils from the bank heist. And then at the same time, 200 miles away at Cape Canaveral, Harold Rosen was an engineer, and he was about to usher in the age of global live television. Basically, he had invented the world's first 24-hour commercial satellite. I think it was nicknamed like Early Bird or something like that. And somehow this engineer's accomplishments derailed the bank heist criminal's way of life. I'm not sure how. I'm not sure how this communication satellite ends up derailing this man who is kicking back on his yacht after robbing a bank. But apparently there's a link there, and this author talks about it and talks about the space age and the Cold War and the moon landing and the civil rights movement, and apparently all of this is connected somehow, and I don't really know how, but it sounds like a really fascinating read. So if you're interested in Satellite Boy, make sure to keep your eye out. It's coming out March 21st. And the last book that I have for you today is also coming out March 21st, but this is a crime fiction book. It's not nonfiction true crime, but it is a crime fiction, and it sounded really interesting, and I've had my eye on it, so I wanted to throw it in here so that y'all can check it out as well. It's called The Donut Legion by Joe Lansdale. This takes place in an East Texas town. So you know, when I hear Texas books, Texas settings, my ears perk up. I'm already interested. In this book, we're following a character named Charlie. He has an ex-wife who has been missing for over a week, and he goes to her house and everything is packed up in boxes. So everyone's starting to think, did she pack up her stuff? Is she running? He's hearing rumors that maybe she's running from these bill collectors or something like that. But the more he digs, the more Charlie starts to think something else is definitely going on here. Part of the reason he thinks that is because she was last seen working at a local donut shop run by a group called the Saucer People. The Saucer People were an evangelical cult, apparently, and they believed that their compound was the site of the next extraterrestrial coming. So Charlie starts investigating into this cult, and he's got this informant within the cult that is helping him gather these details, but then things start to really hit the fan when Charlie finds the body of this informant with its arms severed off. I can imagine that is a freaky thing to figure out, and you probably start to think, what kind of cult am I dealing with? Granted, this is a fiction book, but the book does do a good job of kind of social commentary along the way, talking about these cult groups and these insidious groups and how they basically come into fruition. Like, how do they get started and how do they get people to follow them and who's crazy enough to believe them and go along with it? It examines all of those themes along with a really riveting sounding story. So if you're not into nonfiction true crime, maybe you want to check out The Donut Legion, coming out March 21st. Well, that pretty much wraps up the true crime releases that I've got my eye on for the end of February and into March. I'm sure there are a ton of releases that I have not mentioned here, but I just try to mention the ones that sound the most interesting to me and sound like they might be a really good read so that I can share them with y'all. If you know of others coming out, make sure to share them with us. Put them in a comment below. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know that as well. I can absolutely do more. There are always new true crime releases coming out, so I'm happy to do that. And make sure to like and comment and subscribe. It helps my channel. It helps me know that I'm doing something right. So until then, I will see y'all in my next video. Bye y'all.